Morning, everybody who's joined us. So this morning we'll be talking about supporting Estranged Students Success, improving university policies and services for students without family support. Thank you for taking the time out to join us today. We'll be running a live Q&A for our speakers at the end of the session. So we've enabled Q&A feature. So if you've got any questions, please just pop them in there. I'm Lisa Ravenscroft, the Communications Manager here at ProtectED, and I'm very pleased to welcome today's speakers. Helen Arbour, who's the Manager for Unite Foundation, providing university scholarship support for care leavers and estranged young people. Jaleisha Catnott, Student Support and Welfare Manager at Brunel University, London, and who is a Protected Founder Member University. And Susan Meller, who's the HE Director of Standalone, who support and raise awareness for people who are estranged from their family. So this morning we'll be discussing the support provided by organisations such as Standalone, the Unite Foundation, and how estranged students navigate the requirements for a rent guarantor and the practices and structures universities have developed to support estranged students throughout their term time and holiday periods. Helen, Jaleisha and Susan, welcome. Thank you again for joining us. So the first question is, can you tell us a little bit about your organisation or university team and how you support estranged students? Susan, can I go to you first, followed by Jaleisha and then Helen, please?
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Lisa, for inviting me to partake in this session. So I work for Standalone Charity, and as you've just mentioned, Lisa, we're a charity that campaigns for the recognition of estrangement, and we also provide support for adults who are affected by estrangement very generally across the population. So I'm responsible for the higher education strand of the charity. And really that involves two main elements. So on one hand, there's raising awareness and working with higher education institutions to develop better support for estranged students. And part of that is the Standalone Pledge. And I also work with sector organisations such as UCAS, Student Loans Company, the Office for Students, and of course also the equivalents in the other nations, towards the inclusion of really information, advice and guidance and support for estranged students in national policy. So that's me.
Jaleisha, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jaleisha, and as Lisa said, I'm the manager of the Student Support and Welfare team at Brunel University, London, which is based in Uxbridge, Middlesex. At Brunel, we have two dedicated members of staff that work specifically to support students that are estranged. One member of staff supports students pre-enrollment with the application stage and tackling any barriers to access in higher education, working with students in college and in schools, preparing them for life or future at higher education. And then within my team, we have a named contact named Patricia, who works with these students on course. So once they're enrolled, she is their named advocate to support them with any sort of situation that might occur that would impact on them or on their studies. Yeah, so that's me.
Morning, everybody. It's a rainy day here in the southwest. My name is Helen. I'm the head of operations for the Unite Foundation. The Unite Foundation is a national charity, and we work in partnership with 27 universities across the UK currently. At the heart of what our charity does is to provide scholarships for estranged students, in addition to care leaver students as well. And those scholarships provide 3 separate years of full-year free accommodation to students at our partner universities from that particular background. We're quite a young foundation. We were founded in 2012. We are a corporate foundation. Our principal donor is Unite Students, which is a provider of purpose-built student accommodation and halls. And at the very heart, as I say, of that scholarship is the provision of free accommodation, but also the bringing together of our university partners with the accommodation teams to provide kind of wraparound pastoral support to those students, with the core intention of our support helping them stay on course to complete and succeed in postgrad outcomes. We have an additional strand of work around research that hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about later, and we obviously take our learning both as a charity, but also from the experiences directly of our young people to try and inform the sector as to how the experiences of all care leaver and estranged students can be improved by practice. Good morning.
Thanks everybody for introducing yourselves. So next question. With the vast majority of students going home at the beginning of the COVID-19 lockdown in March, how do you think that this affected estranged students? So if we just go in the same order, so Susan first.
Yeah, so I'll make a start on that. Yes, so what I was really observing and what our surveys showed as well was estranged students really were hit pretty hard by lockdown. I mean, mainly really because they are reliant on themselves and they don't have a parental home to go back to. So as a result, obviously many did find themselves stuck either in their student accommodation in halls, or they actually ended up alone in their flats. Sometimes that had financial implications, that they might have sort of ended up, you know, sort of possibly having to pay rent for others as well as for themselves, or having to move out of their flat because they simply couldn't afford it because everybody else had moved out. But really also what we found a lot was that they felt very, very isolated, certainly without their friends around them, because for estranged students, friends really are very much their family. And also if they were living on campus, obviously there were very few people still around on campus. We also found certainly in one of our surveys and from speaking to individual students, is that some of them did also tell us that the sort of the unwanted contact from family increased over that period, certainly over the lockdown period. And some of them felt really harassed by that, and sometimes even pressurized into going back to potentially a potentially dysfunctional and in some cases very dangerous parental home. So that was really quite a difficult situation for some of them. And really as a result, all of this also really impacted quite hard on students' mental health. So some of them really found the pressure of keeping themselves going on their own in isolation without their friends around really hard. And then there's obviously there was at the time, and there still is, the uncertainty of the near future. And some found it really difficult to deal with, and to such an extent that that I've certainly also had you know, reports of individuals actually contemplating suicide. It even got to that point for some of them. And not to forget obviously the sort of financial implications of all of this. As we all know, estranged students have to work throughout their studies, and especially over the summer holidays. And of course, with lockdown, most of those jobs disappeared. And we found that in the summer, about 75% of estranged students that we surveyed didn't actually really know how they were going to cover even their basic expenses, so rent, bills, food. And a large proportion of them were really relying on their university to help them out. So it really was a very difficult situation for them. And universities were really sort of called to sort of rise to the challenge, I guess.
Jaleisha, do you want to go again second?
So very, very similar to the areas that Susan has raised. We saw similar trends on campus with our students that are estranged during the early lockdown periods and continuing through until now. We had students that were obviously in halls or residences that were seeing other flatmates returning home to other safe places that they could go, and these students didn't have that option to make use of. So they had to remain on campus. We also had as well students that were having unwanted contact from family members at this time, and almost a pressure on them to maybe return back to a home that they felt was unsafe. But we did have as well some serious incidences in homes with family members and students with their family that weren't quite estranged but were having difficult relationships, and the lockdown period then meant that the relationship deteriorated further, and then those students were in need of estrangement support from the university quite quickly. We did see as well the effect on students' mental health, the loneliness and isolation on campus in halls, but also for those that were maybe staying off campus in other locations, that inability to touch base with someone in a regular, frequent manner did seem to have a really big toll on their mental health. We did see a lot of financial distress for students as well. Like Susan mentioned, students that had lost their regular jobs, their regular income, but still had to pay for essentials and accommodation. Students that were sort of in the had plans of getting jobs, and then that was sort of taken away from them. Students that were on paid placements, and those ended, and these students were then left in quite a lot of financial hardship, and that again played a big toll on their mental health as well. One of the other things that we did see on campus as well is the need for us to sort of be a lot more proactive in terms of how we reached out to these students, because I think when all the services sort of closed and everything that was front facing then shut down, there was a necessity to let them know that we were still there, we were still active behind the scenes, they could still contact us remotely, but mainly the toll on their mental health, financial hardship, and that safeguarding issue of the pressure of contact from, or the pressure to return home to a sort of unsafe place. That's something that definitely did come up a lot.
I think it would be quite useful actually to share with
Helen, you've muted.
Oh, apologies, I've accidentally clicked myself off again. Just for context, I think it would be really helpful to give you a quick snapshot of the various surveys that Susan was referencing earlier, because I think they gave a very clear indication of the experiences of estranged students, and also how that experience progressed as the COVID restrictions became tighter and we went into full lockdown. Back in actually almost the first week of March, I think it was, or very early in March, when we were at that stage of very much just becoming aware of the virus, and the national messaging was predominantly around hand washing, but services and normal life, if you like, was still continuing at that time. We surveyed the Unite Foundation scholarship students. As I say, they're across the UK. There are about 254 currently, so it's a decent sized population, and we were surveying them because we always survey them at that time of year, but we took the opportunity to ask how the first parts of social distancing was affecting them, and the feedback that we had at that time very early on was very much an anxiety actually about academic continuation. So the first thought that came to students at the first part was absolutely about their ability to continue studying in the midst of a changing environment and the uncertainty of that unchanging environment. Now, that survey then we came together with Standalone, Become, Spectra and other agencies to then do a national survey, which was later in the progress of COVID. And you could see how that initial anxiety about how to continue studying and access to laptops and having enough Wi-Fi, etc., to be able to go to lectures online, how that progressed very rapidly into severe concern around the practicality still about access to IT, but income. Being able to earn, being able to afford food, being able to cover those practical roof over your head costs that Jaleisha and Susan quite amply illustrated. And then as that progressed through, one could see the impact on mental health as the isolation of those estranged students became more intense. I think there's something that we'll come on to later about what our reflections are, but something in terms of just seeing that very short journey from what are the practical challenges to goodness, am I going to be able to eat? And the stress that financial pressure brings to bear, combined with the social and physical isolation that individuals were feeling in what are normally very vibrant, very hubbub kind of areas on campus. Even for the Unite Foundation scholarship students who have all of their kind of rental costs fully covered and were in a safe, purpose-built space, they were reporting very much that sense of anxiety and actually a little bit of fearfulness about being so separate from their peers. And I think the aspect that we didn't necessarily survey at that time, but has come through in the qualitative or the anecdotal information, is that the stigma of being a student in university that does not have the kind of typical family background that institutions like to imagine that young people have was really amplified at this point in time. So as their peers were discussing how and quickly they were going to be leaving and how they were studying at home and the challenges that they were experiencing, what that did was magnify the difference that students that were staying in the location were experiencing. And I think there's something there about how we as a charity, how institutions in universities can engage with messaging and communication to recognise that when one's communicating with the majority, that actually serves to amplify the minority experience, which adds to a sense of isolation, non-integration, a sense of not belonging, of not being part of that student community. So I think that's a really important thing for us to consider as we go through, to think, how can we reflect on the experience of this?
Sorry, that's me. Thanks. I mean, they were fab answers as usual. So going on from that one, and we have covered some of this, has COVID-19 changed any of your practices or made you relook at the services you offer to students and their universities? If we just go in the same order, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think this is something that probably doesn't really sort of affect us at Standalone quite so much as obviously at the university or a college, because we don't work so much directly with students. But I think what it has done, certainly for my work, is that, as Helen was just saying, it really has shone a light, in a sense, on the struggles of estranged students, and it's really brought that to the fore, especially, you know, because of the experiences of lockdown and all the associated changes across the university and their university experience. So I mean, what it really has done, it's really certainly given me and us as a charity even more of that impetus to sort of continue to campaign really hard for better recognition of this cohort, and also better support for this cohort, and not only on an institutional level, but certainly also on a policy level, national policy level. And one thing that I'm very pleased to say is that because of also the collaboration with the other organisations that Helen's mentioned, so with Unite Foundation and Become, we've been able at Standalone, we've been able to link up as a group, and it's really helped us get more visibility, certainly also with the Department for Education. So there's some really positive, I'd say positive, if there are any in this particular period, but there is a positive impact for us as a charity, and that it really is enabling us to be able to push that visibility and use that visibility of estranged students to push our work forward.
Yeah, speaking from a university perspective, I think for the whole university, for the whole cohort, we worked very quickly to remove things to remote and online in terms of studies and support. But what I felt was very important, and I was very grateful that in our team we do have a dedicated named contact, is because there was a real necessity to make sure that this particular group of students weren't lost in the system. In the applications for hardship fund for all students that were being affected by COVID, it was really important for us to have someone that could make sure that they were following up with students that are estranged, that didn't have alternative support options available, finding out what their needs were and making sure that those were advocated for with the departments necessary to make sure that they were getting the support they needed in a really timely manner. Like I said previously, we did have to reach out very proactively, very frequently. Like Helen mentioned, things changed so quickly. So we were having to almost reach out as and when things were changing to say, how is this affecting you? What are you finding difficult? What support do you need? And then very quickly having to put provisions in place to support those things. So things like IT support for students that were now having to do their lectures online but didn't have a suitable device or connection sort of support. For the hardship fund, we were having to look at how we could support students that couldn't afford the basic necessities, that couldn't do their shop. So we were at a certain point, we were providing supermarket vouchers to these students. Then we were looking at the students that were sort of stuck indoors but couldn't get deliveries out to them. So it was a case of really having to work out what their individual needs were and what we could do as a university to support them. And we kind of had to pull together as a community to sort of make sure that we were able to offer support through all different aspects of the university. So the student services team, the counselling and mental wellbeing, our chaplaincy team, everyone was on hand to offer wellbeing support to these students. We offered workshops and webinars, but we also then were noticing what the difference was between support that was offered to other groups in the university and how they were maybe less affected or affected differently during the COVID period because of the support that they had. And we have looked at our services for students and how we can maybe bring those a bit more closer in line so that we can offer that similar support so these students are also, we're minimizing the effect on them. Emergency accommodation, that was another big one that we sort of had to change quite quickly. The accommodation team did work with us on this because there was an understanding that people weren't going to be able to pay their rent on the due dates because they didn't have the funds to do so. So they supported us to make sure that our most vulnerable students weren't put under any additional distress or pressure in those circumstances. And then where we could, we supported them with emergency funding to pay for accommodation if it wasn't on campus. But this has been quite an eye-opener, I think, for us as a university. And like Susan mentioned, it does make you look overall at your policies and how you've been working in general and think, what can you change for the long run and for the future to make it much more efficient?
As a national charity that does have direct contact with individual students, I think the three areas where we as a charity have made a difference that I think has some parallels to what institutions might be able to look at in their practice. I would say that the first absolutely is the undoubted value of preventative action. It was serendipity that we happened to be in touch with our students at the time. You know, it just happened to be on our timetable that we were going to be surveying students, and we took the opportunity, again, luck rather than judgment at that time, really, to ask about whether or not any of our students had particular vulnerabilities, for example. And so as soon as it was evident that the country was moving to a greater degree of restriction, we knew exactly where all of our vulnerable people were. We knew we could isolate and we could shield students within day. You know, we literally, sometimes the next day we were able to shield somebody completely. Now, I know that sometimes I think it's very hard to justify preventative action, actually, if we're being really candid. I think sometimes in terms of when we evaluate our services, etc., it's easier to report the responsive stuff where a crisis has occurred and you've been able to react to it. But I would say for us as a national charity, what we've really learned is to have confidence in taking preventative action to ensure safety, to avoid something happening, instead of reacting to financial shortfall, to preempt financial shortfall, instead of responding to a mental health crisis, to do everything we can to prevent it. It becomes a harder area for us to evaluate because it's qualitative and you're trying to measure and assess things that might not haven't happened. So that's more challenging, but I think it's given us the confidence and the strength to do that going forward. So we will become a more proactive, preventative focused charity. I think the second area is about that human, emotional, empathetic, compassionate engagement with your young people. I'm still not used to seeing myself on video, but I know that in engaging with Jaleisha and with Susan, these long periods of time without that human contact, emails and phone calls don't quite do it. If you can jump onto a FaceTime or a video call, a house party, a Zoom, there are so many platforms to be able to just get that human connection. Internally within the Unite Foundation, we've called it our Huggy program. So that mix between hygge and, you know, just being able to give somebody a hug. With any email messaging, we're making it much more informal. We're providing a lot of reassurance. So again, in a time of constant change, the amount of messaging that's coming out to young people is tremendous. And so we've put in terms of our program, we're putting a huge amount of reassurance into our messaging, so that if not, you know, if we haven't got something specific to say, we will just be reassuring them in a period of amazing change that we know where they are, we know who they are, we know what their needs are, nothing's going to change about their scholarship, and that we're still here. And so I would really encourage people to reflect on your communications and how you engage, to address the human part in all of us, which just wants to feel safe and secure. And sometimes just having that very personal contact can do that. And within our Huggy program, we're also looking at, you know, practical items. So Christmas and the festive period is often a time when young care leavers, for example, but hopefully estranged young people are being brought into the care leaver focused activities. But we're looking to try and put those practical support elements as much as we can throughout the year. It could be something really as small as, you know, a mug and a hot chocolate. It could be something like a voucher for, you know, a takeaway or one of the delivery food circumstances, something small but regular, practical items that meet a need but also have that human relationship element. So that's our Huggy program. That's another thing I would strongly recommend. And then thirdly, something that we've been working on for years but have not been successful in doing, but we have now, is coming back to the experience of young people, is all of their peers that pre-COVID they would be talking to in terms of university and campus and so on. As those young people moved away, sorry, my computer's just frozen, so I just want to make sure I can see you all. They found that they were being isolated from the common experience of the lockdown, essentially. And what they wanted to be able to do was not to feel so alone. So one of the third action that we've taken is we have created a private Facebook, if you like, a private social network that will enable all of the Unite Foundation scholarship students to connect with one another in a safe, private space where they can share their experience, they can have personal chats, they can create little events, they can do anything. It's their platform. And we just wanted to create a space within the online experience that enabled our young people to connect with young people in similar and shared backgrounds, so that when the rest of the student population was having a different narrative, they could share their narrative and not feel so alone. So the three areas I would say is proactive and preventative, personal and compassionate, and then remember that relationships matter.
Thanks, everyone. I think we covered quite a lot there, actually. So the next question is about accommodation. So when renting student accommodation in the UK, students are likely to be asked to provide a rent guarantor. So without family support, what are the problems estranged students face with this? So if we can go for Susan first again, please.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up this question, Lisa, because this is something I think that that does get a little bit forgotten when it comes to looking at accommodation support for estranged students. I mean, without a guarantor, I mean, students are incredibly limited in their choice of accommodation. And estranged students, as Lisa, you've just said, because they haven't got a family, parents, or a sort of a network, family network to fall back on for a guarantor, they can be really quite stuck. And we hear again and again that estranged students are having difficulties finding a guarantor. They haven't got a guarantor, they can't find one. And as a result, the difficulty is then that they may end up in unsuitable accommodation, which they can afford and they don't need a guarantor for. This can mean it's as I say, inappropriate. It might be unsafe. They might be exposed to, you know, a sort of unsavory a sort of private rental arrangements. And they very often end up absolutely miles away from campus and have to then pay for their travel, and they can't get into their lectures and that sort of thing. So it really is a big issue. And I suppose, what options do students have? Well, one of the options is obviously to go to a private rent guarantor provider. Now, that's often very expensive and usually pretty unaffordable for estranged students. And so really, it's looking to their university for help. Now, some universities do approach this in the way that they actually cover the fees for a private rent guarantor for the estranged students. So they sort of work with the student that way. There are some universities that have guarantor schemes, so they will act as the guarantors themselves, although there are caveats around that. For example, that most of the university guarantor schemes only start from year 2 and not first year students, for example. Some universities may also have an agreement with their accommodation provider to waive the need for a guarantor. So there's lots of different ways of approaching this. But basically, this is one of the really big problems for students in order to help them find appropriate accommodation.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Susan said there. And actually, in my conversations with Susan, with Helen and Lisa, we've actually thought about how our university, how us at Brunel, how we work with students that might require a guarantor that are estranged for their families. And I think Susan kind of hit the nail on the head there, where we don't really consider our students that aren't from the typical family orientated background, that wouldn't have this as an issue, that they wouldn't find it as difficult to find someone to act as a guarantor for them. So with our accommodation on campus, they always have, then a guarantor is not required, and the deposit is very low. But on-campus accommodation isn't always the most feasible or the best option for the student. And we are thinking about, for our estranged students that do want to or have to live off campus, what support are we then able to offer them? the ones that we've had so far, on occasions, we have been able to support them through our dedicated support officer being able to help them fund the funds that they need. But as a long term, and as Helen had mentioned, being proactive, being preventative, for us now, we're thinking about how we can work with a program, with a company, with an organization that is able to provide a very good, safe guarantor scheme for these students, so that we can tie into that, so that we can have that as an option available to these students when they need it. Like Susan said, the downside of not having an option like that is that we then have these students in accommodation that's probably not fit for purpose, not the safest or the best options. And then that then has knock-on effects on their health, their well-being, and also their ability to progress and succeed in their academic studies. So as part of what we're looking at in terms of improving our support for estranged students, we are looking at a guarantor scheme as part of that.
And I think this is a really thorny area, I would have to say, and certainly an area that there's space for us to make progress as a sector, I would say. The first point I would make in relation to guarantors is that it's a systemic issue, isn't it? It's process and form filling, and one can understand why it is as it is, but the nature of systemic practices that essentially discriminate against somebody that doesn't have access to a person who's able to stand as financial insurance for them, which is what we're talking about here. The end result for that at a student level is significant stress. It's a small practical element which is significantly stressful, and perversely may bring a young person who has the least access to financial resources, bring them to a place where they're paying more than their peers in order to just get into the building. So I think it's one of those scenarios that we all recognise doesn't quite work, but the obvious solution isn't clear as yet. But we have to acknowledge that it's a practical barrier, and it absolutely generates significant stress, which impacts on mental health. And all of those factors are risks to that young person continuing in their studies. And that's our shared goal, that they get through their studies and that they graduate with the grade that reflects their potential and ability. So we've got to keep that goal in our mind, I think. As far as the Unite Foundation is concerned, we act as the guarantor for all of our scholarship students. Now, that in itself has its own limitations. We act as a guarantor for them in specific buildings, because we know what the systems and processes of those buildings are. But the way that we interpret a guarantor, I think, is slightly different to how a guarantor might be described elsewhere. And we'd be really keen to reframe the kind of role and the description and the understanding of what a guarantor is there for. In the majority of circumstances, for your atypical students, your guarantor is going to be a parent, and essentially they are standing as financial insurance to protect the income for the rent, essentially. But in reality, they're doing that as a parent. They're doing it from a familial, from an emotional, from a compassionate connection to that young person. And in addition to being the financial backup, they're also the emotional backup and the practical backup, aren't they, to that young person? A guarantor and an emergency contact and a family member are often all rolled in together. From the Foundation's point of view, yes, we are a financial insurance, but we are also that first port of call when a young person is having difficulty within their building and it comes to our attention within the building. We absolutely see our role as guarantor as being more than the bank. That's, we're there for more than just paying the rent. In addition, I think there's something there I'd be really interested for you all that are watching to contact with your relevant departments and ask that question about, is the data there about how many young people who are in your halls of residence, for example, how many of them do actually default? I think there's a real dearth of data about how many young people actually do default and what the backgrounds and the circumstances to those rent failings actually are. I've had the opportunity, because Unite Students is the major donor to the foundation, I've had the opportunity to have informal conversations with the operations function of that business, to say, well, you know, what's the data, what's the intelligence around this, and they themselves are quite anecdotal to say, actually, in their experience, what tends to happen is if a young person falls behind with rent payments, then a guarantor will be contacted and notified. But it doesn't actually then mean that the guarantor is actually paying it. More often than not, anecdotally, is that the guarantor will then step in to engage and support the young person to get back on track. Because often a missed rent payment, etc., is an indication of something else, either that they're just not on top of their budgeting and they just need some support to learn how to budget more effectively to manage the new student life, or it might be actually an indicator of something more serious. And that's an opportunity to be proactive, to engage, to step in, to see holistically how that young person can be supported in order to go to move forward. To my mind, for all students actually, not just estranged ones, it's about recognising that it's not just about rent. So if I could put be quite cheeky and put a call out today, within the Unite Foundation we are actively looking for universities to kind of co-create with us a pilot project about exploring the guarantor function for estranged students and care leavers as required, so that we can start putting together just little bits of data and evidence that we can use to inform this debate. So if anybody else is really interested and motivated in this subject area, then please do put a note in the messages for Lisa to share my contact details with you afterwards, because I feel this is an area that is ripe for exploration.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, definitely we can put that in the
thank you, appreciate it
for you. So ProtectED also advocates, when we work with the universities, are joined up working with teams across the university or institution. But student service teams may not be aware of how campus security can support estranged students. Can you provide any examples of how including the security team in discussions can be better support? We can better support estranged students. So campus security again being involved in the situation. So Susan, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just really very briefly, from me looking at this, I think campus security is actually a really important part of all of the holistic support across an institution for estranged students. And simply, I mean, if I'm thinking of estranged students living on campus, and we've talked about this quite a bit already. In fact, that very often, or especially at the moment, they don't have anywhere else to go. It's their home, and security personnel may therefore often be the only people around at certain times of the day, or especially evening and night. And in some cases, they may well be the first port of call if a student is in distress or in need of help. So I think simply from that aspect, it's really, really important to include security teams and security personnel in this debate and this discussion. And for me, I think one of the most important aspects is actually training, and this is today part of that. Because I think if security knows, or the individuals know what it actually means to be estranged and what the consequences are for those students, and as a result, they are living on their own, they're on campus potentially, they can really look out for students on campus, and they can be very aware of the difficulties that they might be facing, and start to think together with student services how they can support them. So I mentioned earlier the situation where students might be getting unwanted visits from parents or family members and feel harassed. I think there's a real responsibility there as well on security and the state to make sure that you know, not anybody can just walk in and visit somebody and have access to a student living on campus. So it's simple things like that. So I think working together with the student services is really important in that they can, you know, refer to each other. There's referral to student services in terms of what support might be available from the university, and I think vice versa as well, to include the security services teams and management in potentially knowing to look out for students who are living and who don't have that family support. And certainly in terms of the standalone pledge, what we're really asking institutions to do when they sign and take the standalone pledge is to look really holistically at the whole institution and every single department where there are, you know, where there are possibilities and opportunities to improve the support and the service for estranged students. So absolutely, it's a really, really key element in the whole picture.
Yeah, I'm quite pleased to say that, as Susan has described, that relationship between the security team, sort of the estates and residences team and student services, we have developed at Brunel that relationship with those services. And I do have to say that it has been fundamental to how we support our estranged students. Like Susan said, that we do have cases of unwanted contact, and that's not always a case of knowing that it's unwanted contact. We can have concerned parents contacting the university, desperate to get in contact with their child, to come to realize that that child does not wish to have any contact with that parent. So for us, from a policy base, it's fundamental that we are all aware about the policies around sharing information with third parties and confidentiality, that we cannot confirm or deny if a student is a student at Brunel. And that's just the case across the board unless we have consent from the student. Our security team are fantastic with that, but we can also work with them to make sure that they are aware of the students that might be in particular need of extra support or safeguarding. So they are all mental health first aid trained as well, so that they can deal with situations if they are the first point of call for these students 24 hours a day. They know how to deal with these situations sensitively. They also can keep students on a sort of flagged basis so that if anything comes up in regards to that particular student, it's dealt with sort of as a priority. They're aware of what the sensitive situation around that student might be, and they know who to contact in regards to any follow-up support that student might need. There are lots of provisions that our security team have on place that help us to reassure students that might be concerned because they are estranged from their family, because they might not want contact from certain people. We can have it so that certain vehicle numbers are flagged up on the ANPR, so that if they do pull onto campus at the barriers, security are made aware that that vehicle shouldn't be on campus. The security team also work very closely with our police, our local police, and we actually have an on-campus police officer, and they're there to advise and guide the students on anything that could be becoming or has become a legal matter, how to follow up on that. And they work very closely with our student services team to make sure that whilst the legal matter is being dealt with, that student is still getting the support that they require from our teams as well. They, like I said, it's very important from us from the policy basis that they're very aware about confidentiality. We do have actually the security manager that sits in on our student at risk meeting every week, so that they're up to date on any students that are particularly vulnerable to any risk, so that they can communicate that sensitively with the security team and also feed back to us on anything that they can do to help us support those students. But I do have to say that working alongside the security team has been absolutely fundamental for us in supporting these students. In some instances, some serious situations, they have been absolutely amazing in helping us to deal with those really, really quickly. But just in general, it's a real reassurance to these students to know that actually, whatever it is you may be concerned about, first, we have the policies in place to make sure that we are protecting you to the best of our ability. But as a backup to that, we also have a security team that is there and available to deal with you on a one-to-one basis if you want to meet the security manager, or to let you know about all the actual individual provisions that we do have in place to make sure that you are protected and that you are safe whilst you're on campus. And even if you're in the local area or off campus, they do what they can to make sure that we're supporting these students.
From the Unite Foundation's point of view, this is the area that we have the least direct involvement with, but what I can do is share just two contrasting examples to try and illustrate where campus security can play a role, certainly. So one example was a young person who was estranged from their family around cultural elements, and a member of the family essentially tailgated them from a lecture to identify their halls of residence, and obviously the young person felt under threat of further assault, essentially, and fantastically the mechanism enabled. And this isn't the foundation, this is the foundation partners, essentially. This is the university and the accommodation, all teams working together. So the first feedback I would say is, where possible, university services and accommodation provider services, if they're separate to the university itself, wherever you can build links then will always reap reward. And certainly in my experience on the ground, safety and security officers, whether they're employed by the university or employed by a halls of residence, have a shared goal and like to come together to collaborate to work more effectively. So I think the drive for partnership working is always there on the ground. The challenge is always how to make it work from a policy and practicality. You know, it's almost bureaucracy that prevents the natural human tension of collaborative working to succeed. But this was one example where a young person was tailgated. They were identified where they were living. The accommodation provider and the university security and student wellbeing services then put in place a temporary relocation for that student so that they weren't in that setting, essentially protection in terms of their transport into and off, and also then the preventative action, similar to an example you referenced there, Jaleisha, where the security then were proactively looking for the relevant estranged family members to remove them from the area, essentially. So that's one area here. Another example, I think, of where campus security have such a role to play is actually around protection for vulnerable young people that might be in crisis. So we had an example, I won't go into detail, obviously, where a young person was identified by campus security, and they were very, very vulnerable, experiencing a mental health crisis. And that campus security is the first port of call in terms of enabling that young person then to be supported into a safe setting. So whilst I can't really comment necessarily on the university element of it, what I would recommend is that there's always the human desire to work more effectively. Anybody in any job just wants to be more effective. What I would wonder, and I perhaps ask those attending to consider, is where within your institution does the health and safety agenda tie up with the student experience and student well-being agenda? Because there's a significant amount of overlap there between that which is health and safety and that which is actually well-being, particularly around vulnerable student groups, of which estranged students potentially can be one. So then the final point, is I'm conscious in many areas, campus security can be an area where you're looking on contracted staff. So I think the first port of call is absolutely look through your own policies and practices to see if inadvertently you have built into the wording of it an assumption that A, everybody has a family, and B, that all family members are constructive and positive. So just that kind of process order is valuable, but when you're looking at how you bring potentially contracted staff within to that broader team, look really carefully about what are your cornerstones of your messaging to ensure that members of staff that are coming on perhaps for short periods of time and don't have that wealth of background training have the key cornerstones in place that give you confidence that they will protect, secure and be proactive about your student population.
Thanks for those answers. Again, yeah, I mean, part of ProtectED, we do advocate different teams in universities working together, and obviously this shows that when they do, you can definitely help. So next question, we've got 2 questions left, but we've only got 5 minutes. If everyone's happy to just carry on for a little while. So the Protective Code of Practice looks at issues impacting student wellbeing and mental health over non-teaching periods like Christmas break. I know a couple of you have picked up on this actually, on little bits. How do you think universities might better provide for estranged students over these periods?
Yeah, so if I start that one off again, and again, both my colleagues will have a much more sort of in-depth examples and insight into how it works sort of on the ground. But I think, again, broad overview, or very generally speaking, we know that many estranged students find Christmas really the most difficult time of year. For many, it triggers real feelings of loss, loneliness, but also, and I think Helen, mentioned this earlier, it's also about the stigma of not having a family. And the difficulty for many is that they, how do you explain, or do you have to always explain why you're not going home for Christmas? And this puts an enormous pressure on them, and it's really, really uncomfortable. And many students say they just make something up because they don't necessarily want to go into the whole thing about, I'm estranged and I'm not in contact with my parents or my family. So I think it's being very, very mindful of that. And so, I mean, there are really 2 aspects here for me. I mean, the most obvious is, I think, is again, something that we've already touched on, is to make sure that estranged students have opportunities to take part in any kind of activity, be it virtual or otherwise, the university is putting on over the Christmas period and over the holidays, to make sure that they're included, involved, and they're not isolated. But I think also it's about creating a real culture of understanding and acceptance that can help estranged students feel less uncomfortable about their situation, and obviously when it comes to Christmas and the Christmas period, about having to talk about their situation and explain their situation. And actually, at Standalone, I don't know whether any of you are aware, but we have our Estranged Students Solidarity Week at the end of November every year. And the reason why we put it at the end of November was really because of the build up to Christmas, and it's about using that week to raise awareness of estrangement and to work towards creating that culture and that understanding of students who don't have a family to support them and the family to go back to. So this year we are actually focusing specifically on the topic of how to be an ally to estranged students during that week. And the week is there for everybody to participate. So it's really aimed at student unions, but also university staff from any department you can put things on, you can start conversations, you can raise awareness, and also students themselves to participate. And we're developing some resources at the moment, which I'm going to very hopefully be launching next week. And during the week, we're going to be running campaigns on social media as well. So I'll let Lisa have the link to the resources and the information about Estranged Student Solidarity Week. So if you're interested, to have a look at that and see how you might be able to participate during that week. So that would be really great to, have as many people on board during that week as possible.
Thanks, Susan. I'll definitely share that with everybody.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks.
Yes, at Brunel, we are participating in the Estranged Students Solidarity Week. We've got a variety of things that we'll be doing during that week. Like Susan said, focused around raising awareness for these students and the fact that their situation may be different from other people that are on campus or at the university. But also, I do agree that there is something around building a culture that in general does recognise that not everybody has a home to go to for many different reasons. And in doing that, we take away a bit of that uncomfortability of a student having to explain why they may not be going home for Christmas, because many students may not be going home for Christmas for different reasons. But we're going to use that week at the end of November to really focus on raising awareness for our Estranged students and the things that might affect them around the Christmas period, and how, as an ally, you can support them. We're also doing a Christmas fundraiser appeal just to help us purchase some gifts for these students, be it something big or small, just so that we can give them something to have on Christmas Day, and also an option that if they don't celebrate Christmas, they can just have a gift for this festive period, this holiday break. We also will be doing a festive lunch on Christmas Day on campus. Depending on what tier we're in during that time, it will either be something where they can, in a socially distanced manner, meet with people to have a Christmas meal, or they will have a meal that's delivered to them in their halls of residences if they're on campus. But we will be doing that. The Christmas period, we always do try to have things going for all our students that will be on campus. But for our Estranged students specifically, at the end of November, or the end of December, so the 16th of December, our named support officer puts on a wellbeing workshop session, which is focused around coping with social isolation, because apart from the festivities of the holiday and all the things around spending time with family and friends and loved ones, there is also that period of time when the campus closes for Christmas holiday. And again, we're back into that period where there's not that many members of staff even to touch base with. So sort of just before we start to close for Christmas, we do that workshop where we can just talk to students about how they might cope with social isolation, what to do during the Christmas period if they do need some extra support, who they can touch base with. And again, our security team are there all over Christmas, and they are mental health first aid trained, and they are 24/7. So they're always there. Even if a student just wanted to make a phone call to someone just to have a chat, our security team are quite open with, that's fine, they're happy to do that. And that's something that we really draw on during the Christmas closure period.
I'll be short and sweet because I think it was me that's dragged us over time, sorry. What we'll be doing with our young people is actually, because our scholarship students are actually incredibly diverse, estranged and care leaver students that form part of our scholarship team are overrepresented in all of those areas that the general student population are underrepresented. So actually, we tend to kind of dial down a little bit actually in terms of the Christmas focus actually, because so many of our students don't celebrate that as a festive holiday anyway, you know, and all of the other elements that have been clearly articulated. So we tend to dial down actually. We have some practical things, and we'll be continuing with our Huggy personal program. But the advantage, I think, of us having established this private social network is it enables us actually to pass to the students to actually in and amongst themselves to identify if there is anything specific that they want over that period of time. Because for some young people, they really will want to go the full bells and whistles, and for other young people it's a non-event anyway, and for others, as Susan very well articulated, is actually a trigger and something that they need to have a kind of constructive counterbalance to manage their way through. So what the 6 circles kind of social network for the foundation students enables us to do is respond to, you know, give them the opportunity to kind of tell us what they want from us during that period of time, and then we can leverage with our university partners and with our corporate partner in terms of the accommodation provider to respond to that. And actually, by trying to build that community of people with similar experience, we're hoping that that becomes that wider social network to share that experience. Be like the alternative Queen speech, won't it, in terms of having different kind of family and different groupings of people together on that particular day and through that festive period. Can I just put one quick note in again? Sorry, it's a kind of a request and a call out, I suppose, to the universities that are attending today, is when we get beyond the coronavirus phase of our lives, however long that might be. I do think all of the university holidays are superb opportunities to engage with not just estranged students or care leavers, but any student that is staying on campus, international, etc., to bring them into your workforce for the kind of conference seasons and those activities where you might be using the facilities of the university for other activities. These are a group of young people that are local, ready and willing to kind of be part of your constructive workforce. So I would really urge you all to consider them as an asset, that they're there during the periods of time when other students might not be.
Thank you, everyone. So we've got one question that was asked from an audience member. So if we just answer that one quick before we finish. I know we've lost a few attendees, but we'll just, if we just do this one quickly. So they've asked, in what ways do you normally communicate with and support estranged students? So face-to-face, telephone, email, website, etc. And have any of these changed due to COVID?
Could I take that one first?
Yeah, and that's probably as well, probably more Helen and Jaleisha.
Yeah, I would say for us as a foundation, what has changed is that we have become much more personal and one-to-one and speedy, and a use of a lot more video. So we text, we FaceTime, we do less of the bulk emails that we used to do, trying to communicate with all of our young people at the same time. We're much more conversational, and that takes a little bit more time. But the relationship and the ability to understand where a particular student is at enables you to respond in a much more impactful way.
Yeah, normally we would communicate through all means, and we would definitely do face-to-face meetings. We usually have the officer in our actual student centre for students to come in and speak to her, but she would also put on events on campus for students to come and visit. With COVID restrictions being put in place, those had to stop. But what the named contact was doing was that she was making herself available even in a drop-in session where she would sit on a Zoom call for a particular amount of hours and just give students the opportunity just to pop in and have a chat with her. We were doing quite a lot more emails and phone calls. The emails more were about sending information out, just checking in on students, letting them know that there's been an update, there's a new provision available. But there was quite a lot of phoning around. I know she spent a load of hours sort of just phoning through students on the list, just checking in, just touching base with them, just making sure everything's okay, giving them, like Helen said, that one-to-one, that personal sort of feeling that somebody is empathetic of their situation, is aware of their situation and is there and available to offer the support.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate that we've gone over, so my apologies for that. Thanks for attending, everybody who's still there. So sorry if you that we've gone over, and thank you to Helen, Jaleisha and Susan for being with us this morning, and again sorry for going over, but it was such an interesting topic. I think we could have carried on for a lot longer. The video of this morning's session will be made available on our ProtectED website, so if you missed part of it or you know someone who couldn't attend, then obviously please share. And we'll also send out the information mentioned throughout the session from Helen and Susan. And then we shall be advertising our next event, which will be on Thursday, the 26th of November, shortly. So please make sure that you keep an eye out for that. So nice to see everybody, and thank you so much for attending. Thanks.